People have been asking me the last few days for my advice on how to get into RPGs, specifically tabletop RPGs, which is something I've been playing for a long time. I think I'm into my 12th year of playing RPGs, which is a long time. I'm starting to feel old here. But yeah, a lot of people have asked me to explain what the hell an RPG is, and more importantly, how exactly do you get into it? Because it's not really something that's widely known. I mean, I know it's been mentioned a few times on things like The Big Bang Theory, where they've mentioned Dungeons and Dragons, but people go, isn't that just some weird nerdy thing? Or even if they like the sound of it, they're kind of confused as to how to get into it. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and make a vlog and talk about what I think is the best way to get into an RPG, and some of the best games to play if you're a complete, noob. So I suppose I should tell you how I got into it. I got into it back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I actually got into it just as Dungeons and Dragons entered its 3rd edition. I should probably explain what that means. Dungeons and Dragons has been around since the 70s, and it's gone through various iterations, and the longest running one was 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons, which was known as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The company that made it, TSR, kind of went belly up in the 90s, and in the late 90s the license was sold to Wizards of the Coast, and in 2000 we got 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, which is this. This is the edition I started playing. It's a fairly thin book, I've got to admit, but it was completely different from 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. It was in some ways a lot more accessible. In other ways, it was a bitch. It got rid of a lot of the more confusing rules for Dungeons and Dragons, and it gave it it introduced the D20 system, which was a much more straightforward mathematical system whoa, my camera's light just white balanced the shit out of me. What was it? Yeah, it dispensed with a lot of things like THAC0, and replaced it with a much more simplified scaling number system where everything was worked out with a 20-sided dice and a table, which might sound simple, but believe me, if you've never played it before, it's a bitch. We're now, of course, into the 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. So, what is Dungeons and Dragons? Well, I know a lot of people who are going to be watching this are going to be like, what is Dungeons and Dragons? Fuck! I know what D&D is, I know what a tabletop role-playing game is. You don't need to explain it, motherfucker. But this is for the complete noobs. A tabletop role-playing game is exactly like playing an RPG on your PC without your PC. You sit around a table with your friends, and one of them acts as the game master. He is literally the world. He plays everyone you meet, he controls all the monsters, he dishes out all the treasure, he tells you what you see, and then it's up to the players to make their decisions of what they do in the world. Combat is worked out using dice and stat scores, and if that sounds boring and stupid, it can be. But if it's done right, it's a really, really good way to spend your time. It's social, it's fun, it's a great hobby. So, how do you get into it? That's something I've kind of been asked a lot. I've been asked that a few times since I've gone back to university, and people are kind of like, well, how do I start? Or, where do I start? And the easiest way to do that, honestly now, depends on the type of game you want to play. Some people are very interested in tabletop RPGs, but they're not interested in the classic fantasy Dungeons and Dragons world. They want something different. And hey, you're covered for that, because really the tabletop RPG market at the moment is completely saturated with different types of games. There's an awful lot. I'll show you some of them. You saw the Dungeons and Dragons game. You've also got things like Champions on Champions. There is an MMO based on this, but honestly, the tabletop game is an awful lot more varied and an awful lot more diverse. It's a superhero RPG. Likewise, we've got Vampire the Masquerade. I'm sorry, Vampire the Requiem. Vampire nerds are going to shoot me in the face now. This is one that's being reinvented, I think, just as radically as Dungeons and Dragons. It's gothic horror in which you play, obviously, a vampire. There's also versions of this game where you play a werewolf, a mage, or even a monster hunter. And I gotta admit, I like the monster hunter one the best. But I'll do another video of that because I do want to actually talk about World of Darkness in a bit more detail, both what I liked about it and my problems with it. So, really, the best way to start an RPG is to buy what they call a core rulebook. They're either called the Player's Handbook or the Core Rulebook, either one. These are two core rulebooks for two totally different games. This is for my favourite game. It's called Pathfinder. I'll talk about that in a minute because Pathfinder is interesting. This one is for a game called Traveller. And Traveller is a great game if you want to play something that's very space orientated. I know you can get source books for Traveller that let you play things like Babylon 5, they let you play things like Blake 7, I believe there's one for Star Trek as well, although I'm not exactly sure. But you could very easily adapt this into a Star Trek RPG. It's a very cool game. But if you do want to get into RPGs, I would say that the best place to start is with a fantasy RPG, because fantasy RPGs tend to be the ones which are geared more to new players as opposed to more advanced players. And really, you're a bit spoiled for choice at the moment because you've got a choice of Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder. Now, Pathfinder's a game that it is Dungeons and Dragons. It's the next iteration of Dungeons and Dragons. And I suppose I should explain that. When 3rd edition came to an end, when they first released 3rd edition, it was essentially broken as all hell. Some classes were insanely powerful, just ridiculous. And if a party had one in, he would end up dominating the party. The one that comes to mind is clerics. Clerics were combat beasts. They were basically supposed to be priests, healers, supporters, but some of their spells were so ridiculously overpowered, especially in the expansion books, that they could pretty much march through anything and just kill it. So, they made Dungeons & Dragons version 3.5, which is supposedly a fix, but it had a whole host of problems of its own. Pathfinder is the next incarnation of that, because Wizards of the Coast, the people who make Dungeons & Dragons, decided that it would be a really, really good idea to just overhaul the system, which is good and bad. Personally, if you were wanting to start with an RPG that you'd never ever played one ever before in your life, I would say, if I can grab it, this is the game to start with. This is Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. This is the core rulebook set. You can get a version of it now, which is called Dungeons & Dragons Essentials, which looks like this. It's essentially the same game. I'll put that down because this one's easier to hold and easier to show the camera. There's two core rule books for Dungeons & Dragons Essentials, and I've got to admit, I love these books. I think these are some of the best RPG books I've ever played. They're compact, they're portable, and the RPG itself is very, very concise. If you've played World of Warcraft, if you've played any sort of MMO on the market, you can pick this up and you can learn to play it in very, very short order. There's two big starter boxes with the game as well, which, look, like this, white boxes. There's also a beginner's kit, which I don't have on me at the minute. It's called the Red Box. It's awesome. It is possibly one of the best beginner's kits I've ever seen for a complete newbie who's never played anything like an RPG in his life. And it's very reasonably priced because, believe me, this ain't a cheap hobby. It can be a cheap hobby if you're only interested in one game, but if you're like me and you like to collect lots of different games, it can be an expensive hobby. So that's Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. Very simple, very quick game. Very ergonomic. It's not a scary game at all. It's very hand-holdy. It's very, very friendly game. The other option is this. And I'd have to recommend this one over the Red Box. This is the Pathfinder Beginner's Box. The downside of the Red Box is, once you've actually got the Red Box, you have to go out and buy other books. You can't just run a game with the Red Box. It lets you make a character and run that character through a simple adventure and then move on into a party. Yeah, you can actually solo adventure, so you don't feel ridiculous when you're first working out the rules, which is a good thing. But the Red Box, it doesn't really give you any sort of tools for game mastering, as far as I can recall. As I say, I don't have it, I can only remember. But it doesn't exactly give you very many tools for game mastering. It's a players only thing. So you're still stuck needing a game master, which if you're a complete noob and you don't know anyone who can game master, then you're screwed. I think this is the better deal. It's slightly more expensive, but it is absolutely chock full. It's got everything that the Red Box has got in it. Like, it's got the solo adventure, it's got some annotated character sheets, which I think are a godsend, because it took me a long time to master character sheets for 3rd edition. When I was learning to play, it was very, very confusing, and to be honest, the character creation guide in 3rd edition was a big pile of bollocks. This, not so. Walks you through it stage by stage. It takes you through almost a choose-your-own-adventure book adventure, but it also has a basic game mastery kit in. And really, if you just want to play casually and you just want to play quick adventures with a few friends, very occasionally, this is a really good investment, because you've got multiple ways to build a character in this. You've got basic JM tools, you've got a basic monster manual. You can play, you can play games, I think up to, does it actually say? It doesn't say, but I've got a funny suspicion it lets you make characters up to 4th level. So you could play a decent game with this. Before you would go off and invest in this, which is the core rulebook, which I've got to say, it's a big damn book. It takes an awful lot to invest in this book. So, that's how you begin. Buy a beginner's box. Get yourself, just sit down, put an evening aside, and just sit down and go through the beginner's box adventure. Play the character sheet. Then go and find yourself a group. And once you've found a group, everything will fall into place. If you like game mastering, go for it. I game master more than I play, to be honest. And I get a lot of fulfillment out of it. Don't be scared of the hobby. It can seem very intimidating at first, but go for it. You'll love it. It's a great thing to do over a few drinks at a Chinese takeaway. I guarantee it.